Membrane transport is a necessary function that is essential for cellular life. Transport involves many aspects such as the discharge of waste, the transport of molecules, and general maintenance of a cell. When one refers to membrane transport, they are referring to the movement of particles across or through membranous barriers. These barriers are typically made up of phospholipids. A large part of membrane transport is dependent on the permeability of the membrane. Solute particles that move across the membrane travel the membrane via three ways: active, passive, and facilitated transport. Active transport uses to pump molecules against the gradient of the membrane. Passive transport, on the other hand, is the movement of molecules down the concentration gradient. As opposed to active transport, passive does not require cellular energy to function. Facilitated diffusion is the process of random or spontaneous passive transport of molecules across the membrane by means of a carrier protein.
Transport membrane proteins are P2X receptors. Grooves are found in the structure of these proteins, which are most likely ATP binding sites. The ATP binding site can easily be opened. This creates a pore for ions and molecules to move through the cell membrane into the cell. Transport membrane proteins with an ASIC structure allow for sodium ions to enter and leave the cell. The ASIC structures mediates passive transport by allowing for specific ions to easily enter or exit the cell. The ASIC structure does not allow for any other ions or molecules to enter the cell.
Passive transport naturally occurs and does not require energy to happen. The diffusion of water is an example of passive transport into the cell. These are two main classes of transport proteins: channel and carriers. Channel proteins act as pores that open and close to allow solvents such as ions or ATP to move down a gradient and bind to proteins. Both contain vestibules, which are small openings where ions can travel through a central pore that opens and closes the passageway of these ions. Some contain vestibules, which are small openings where ions can travel through a central pore that opens and closes the passageway of these ions. Carrier proteins move substrates down a concentration gradient.
A specific example of a transport protein is aquaporin. Aquaporin is a specific type of channel protein that lets only water travel through the membrane. Water enters the protein and flips midway through, then continues into the cell or out of the cell. Aquaporin channel proteins help with osmosis and allow the cell to be in equilibrium with the outside. Aquaporin transport proteins do not allow any other molecules besides water through. Active transport is when the transport protein uses energy from the cell to go through the membrane. The protein performs this through ATP-powered pumps by using ATP, or energy, to pump ions or small molecules against the concentration gradient. The ion or small molecule is coupled with the hydrolysis of ATP to ADP and pi, which releases energy in order to go against the flow of molecules. The ATP that powers this process comes from respiration in the mitochondria. This function is vital for molecules to get in and out of the cell when they have to go against the concentration gradient.
Transport! Transport! It's a membrane transport.